Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. It's been a great week for the podcast, with the episode on Suharto becoming the most downloaded episode yet in its first week. This is the result of people sharing the podcast on Twitter. So, if you feel like retweeting the podcast to your followers, you can find me on Twitter at hated_and_dead. Today is the first time I've delved into the world of royalty on the show, though I'll let you know when the episode on Prince Andrew is due to air. The subject today is Alfonso XIII of Spain, who ruled from 1902 until 1931, although he was technically king from birth because of the death of his father. Rather than being obviously hateable, I would say that inept might be a better word to describe Alfonso. He fulfills clichés of a deluded emperor giggling atop a slowly crumbling empire. When Alfonso was born, Spain was hardly in a great state, but it was stable. But the loss of its last colonies and the rise of socialism rocked the country's right wing, and soon Spain found itself in a vicious cycle of short-lived government and control by the army. Eventually, Alfonso was caught up in this maelstrom, and Spain became a republic in 1931. Given the awful civil war that started in Spain just 5 years later, Alfonso's reign is a warning against what can happen when elites become disconnected from the concerns of ordinary people, and the discontentment this can cause. My guest for today is Francisco Romero Salvado of the University of Bristol, or Paco to his friends, who has written a shelf full of books about this period. His knowledge about Alfonso and his entertaining style of delivery were great to listen to. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Alfonso XIII. Good evening, Paco. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And yourself?
Yeah, it's going well. We're talking today about Alfonso XIII, who was King of Spain from 1886 until 1931.
1902.
He was
1902.
a king from birth and formally became king in 1902. Thank you. His reign encompasses most of what's known as La Restauración, the Restoration. For a bit of background, who in terms of personnel and what in terms of values, institutions, were the Spanish attempting to restore during this period?
The name of this period that the scholars use is either the liberal monarchy or the Restoration monarchy. The Restoration monarchy, the name comes from the fact that the Bourbons were restored to the throne. They had been overthrown a couple of times. The last time it was in 1868 during the so-called Glorious Revolution. So the grandmother of Alfonso XIII was overthrown after a pronunciamiento and a revolt. So in 1874, a new army coup restored the Bourbons. And the person who came, Isabel II, was not popular at all, so she had to abdicate, and the person who was restored to the throne was King Alfonso XII. The real architect of the entire new political order was actually a historian himself by profession, a fairly modern politician for his age, fairly intelligent. It was a man called Antonio Cánovas. And what Antonio Cánovas cleverly did was to create what it was the beginning of a modern liberal order, and he introduced this system that looked very much. In fact, Cánovas, during his exile, he spent a lot of time in England, and he used to spend time hanging out in the House of Parliament here in Westminster. So he saw this kind of setting that the British had. At the time, you remember that you had the liberals and the conservatives. Mostly was Gladstone and Disraeli, if I'm not wrong. And he thought, well, this looks pretty cool. This is fine. It seems to be working very well for the British. And he kind of copied the system into Spain. So you have for nearly 50 years two main political parties that they were called dynastic because they were loyal to the dynasty. And again, one was the conservatives, led by himself, Antonio Cánovas, and then there was the other, the liberals, led by his rival, a man called Maxides Mateo Sagasta. So for 50 years you have this kind of rotation in office of these two parties. The thing is that when you start analyzing a little bit the period, the problem is that I'm not a great expert of British politics of the period, but I imagine that the alternation of the two parties in Britain responded to some kind of genuine popular mandate and vote. But in Spain was all artificial. What Cánovas did was basically to create a system that it was mostly fraudulent. So it was based on nepotism, cronyism, and what he institutionalized was the services of the traditional local bosses of every province, and they delivered the right results and fixed the results in every constituency. So that guarantee this kind of perfect alternation in office between two political parties.
Yeah, I think to some extent the British elections of those times were, as you said, kind of decided by some type of election results that were actually genuinely responded to and listened to. I think you can probably over-egg the extent to which that was the case as well. But I've heard these alternations between liberals and conservatives described as kind of peaceful turns, turnos pacíficos.
In Spain it's called el turno. The term to describe the system is el turno pacífico. That means, the peaceful rotation. Because the great advance that Cánovas introduced is that if you look at the history of Spain, the decades before, nothing was peaceful. So you had decades of constant coups, civil wars, all kinds of short-lived administrations. You had 3 different monarchies, 2 types of republic. So what Cánovas brought to Spain was some kind of political stability.
I would imagine that having these predetermined alternations was actually quite good because it guaranteed the circulation of different elites and kind of provided some sort of redress within the system, at least early on.
Yes. Up to recent times, normally scholars working on the period were extremely negative about restoration politics. Today, the view is a bit more nuanced. I'm not saying there are a lot of scholars cheering for a system that was absolutely fraudulent, but on the other hand, looking what there was before and after, it was definitely a period of relative stability, because what Cánovas did was what you said. It created a system through which the elites of the country could alternate in office without having any problem or any crisis. But obviously, the problem is that by having a system that is in theory liberal, but in practice is a monopoly, it represents an oligarchy that monopolizes politics, what you've got is a divorce between a huge majority of the population and these political elites, because the elites, sorry to make propaganda of my last book, but my last book was called Political Comedy, Social Tragedy, because you have on the top this kind of perfect political system, this perfect alternation. And let me stress this, the elites were real elites in the sense that they were magnificent in terms of how gifted orators they were, many were authors, so they were kind of the cultural political elite of the country. But the system disenfranchised the majority of the population. Therefore, the real economic and social grievances that were quite deep and quite important were never addressed. And this created a situation of tragedy. So what you've got during this so-called liberal period is times that the social crisis explodes. and the politicians have to resort always to repression. It's a liberal system. There is freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, freedom of press, so you can express it. But if you want to take action, is when suddenly the politicians resort more and more to the army.
You mentioned economic and political problems that manifested themselves during this time. Alfonso XIII was born in 1886. He was technically born as king already because his father had died before his birth.
Yes.
Which obviously put him in quite an odd position. What were the main economic and political challenges that Spain was facing at the time of Alfonso XIII's birth, or at least in his early years, technically as king?
There were many problems. The first problem that I think affected a lot his life is that Spain, during his youth, before he became king, just tiny few years before he became king, Spain went through this massive crisis that was the colonial wars. And Spain had to fight for years in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, and above all in Cuba. And that ended with the United States entering the war, and as you can imagine, there is no match there. And Spain lost the last remnants of the empire. So, in the kind of the elite system, in the kind of elite explanation of what Spain is, Spain always sold itself as this kind of original, the first, the great empire, the one that had civilized the world, etc. Now, he inherited a country that was in absolute decline. Spain overnight went from being, in theory, still among the great powers, still had significant imperial power, colonial power, to being a country in ruins, in decline. So that affected the life of Alfonso XIII. One of the questions of Alfonso XIII, that proved to be a mistake, but that's is that he tried kind of undo what he saw that his mother had done. Because when the King Alfonso XII dies, his wife becomes the Queen Regent. And until Alfonso XIII takes over in 1902. So the Queen, the Austrian Queen, presided over the colonial disaster, the loss of the last colonies. So Alfonso XIII, one of his quests, one of the things that dominated his life was the kind of trying to make Spain great again. And in order to do so, he thought Spain had to have a new empire. So he involved Spain into a new colonial adventure that was Morocco. And Morocco turned out to be another disaster in terms of massive economic losses, massive economic expenditure. Also, it proved to be a very long colonial war. Morocco became officially, Spain was given the protectorate at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1904, and then became officially the protectorate in 1912. But Morocco was not pacified until 1927, and Spain suffered massive defeats. There was the colonial defeat of Anual, in which nearly 10,000 Spanish soldiers were wiped out. And also, it proved a blunder because, unlike the wars in the 1890s, that it was an imperialist war, that it was kind of massively supported in Spain. If you look at the 19th century, social imperialism is very important in Europe. The masses really believe in the supremacy of the white race, and the white race could go, and when the British go to India or the French go to wherever, people are cheering. It's a thing that is seen as good for the country, rallies the country round. 1890s is the same. The entire country is behind the effort to maintain the colonies. But when the colonies are lost, you've got not only the trauma of the defeat, but you've got the backlash that the colonial armies, the troops were actually made up of the lower classes of society, because the system in Spain, I think Spain was not the only one, but the system in Spain was that if you were rich enough, that your parents had 2,000 pesetas, that it was quite a lot of money for the time, you could buy yourself out of the military service. You didn't have to go. So it was basically the proletariat, the humble classes, that actually went and fought in the Philippines and Morocco. Nearly 60,000 of them died. When a new adventure begins in Morocco now in the 20th century, there is not this kind of close links. Cuba had been one of the first Spanish colonies. It was even discovered by Christopher Columbus in his second trip. So the Spaniards were for 400 years in Cuba. There were very close links. A lot of Spaniards lived in Cuba. But that wasn't the same with Morocco. So there was this bitter memory, because it's still fresh. In 1898, the Spanish army returns defeated, 60,000 losses, many casualties, people injured for life. And then a few years later, the proletariat are told again to fight now for Morocco. What have we lost in Morocco? There are many, the list is too long. But the other problem is that Alfonso XIII also very much saw himself, above everything else, he saw himself as an army officer. Is this idea of soldier king. So Alfonso XIII never really appreciated his politicians. He treated them like lackeys. He was very close with the army. And after 1898, before Alfonso XIII, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of army officers and troops all over the colonies. Now you have this army back in Spain. What do you do with them?
I just want to touch a bit more on Cuba for a second, because it seems, and this is something I want to ask you in a second as well, but it seems at least like an immensely significant moment to have lost, as you said, one of its earliest colonies in such an embarrassing fashion to the United States in 1898. One of the things that it does is that it unleashes this idea that Spain needs a strongman. Do you think that, obviously, as Alfonso got older and started to take on more responsibility as king, that he began to see himself as this strongman?
Well, to a certain extent, you are right. Let me correct something. What we historians normally do is when there is the centenary of a big event, and the case was like 98, so we are talking 1998, 100 years later, there is this kind of upsurge of studies about that period. And I was part of a team working with people like Professor Sebastian Balfour at LSE. And what these historians think today is that there was an exaggerated perception of the events. What happened is that those who perceived things exaggerately were the political and economic and cultural elites of the country. Not most of the country. Most of the country really couldn't care less. In fact, the loss of Cuba was fine. What they didn't want is to go to Morocco. But when it comes to the cultural elites, and this is important, this is a period of a new golden era in terms of cultural elites in Spain. Spain, during the 16th and 17th century, is a leading powerhouse of artists, authors, Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Calderón, you name it. Then there is a great decline in Spanish literature, philosophy during the 18th century. By the late 19th century, you have the revival of Spanish literature, Spanish poetry, and you have all these big names, even philosophy. So you have Unamuno, Baroja, the Machado brothers, Valle Inclán, José Ortega y Gasset, big names at the time in Spain and in Europe. And what you've got is that these cultural elites now, facing with the defeat of Spain, is them, basically them, who start focusing on what is Spain, where are we going, what is it happening, what kind of nation is this. Are we a sick nation? What can we do to solve it? This group of authors, that in fact is an eclectic group because it's not like the former school, is known as the generation of 1898. And these authors began to give different prescriptions. Like they used at the time, not only in Spain, all over Europe and the world, they used a lot of biological terms. And in this case, Spain was a sick nation. So, like a sick person, something needs to be done. So the doctor had to give a prescription in order to heal the patient. And you've got different prescriptions here. But answering to what you said before, one of the prescriptions is that Spain needs not to go out and learning from foreign values and principles, because this is what has been the disaster for Spain, the introduction of all these isms, liberalism, socialism, you name it, all these foreign ideas that came in the 18th and 19th century. What Spain has to do is to go back, to look back at this golden age, essential Spain. And before you have this kind of liberal system, liberal orders, what you need is to find a leader, a strong leader. You don't need politicians that are all corrupt, they're all fraudulent. You don't need parliaments that are talking shops. What you need is a real man of stature. And the term that they use at the time, again, look, we are talking about like biological terms, genetical terms. They use the word cirujano de hierro, iron surgeon. Because if Spain is sick, in order to save Spain, you need to take radical measures. Not to a very sick person, you don't give a couple of paracetamols. Probably what you need is to take this man to hospital, and this man should undergo real radical surgery. That's the tradition that is what you call the right-wing tradition that comes from 1898. Alfonso XIII, if you ask me, there is a moment, I think, in the early 1920s that probably he thinks he could be it. He could be it. And in fact, he toys with the idea in 1923. But he's beaten, like in the showdown in the West, he's beaten in the draw by another guy who actually has a better claim than himself, that is General Miguel Primo de Rivera.
Yeah. If we can just take a step back for a second, I want to talk about one sort of, obviously the very big element or episode that happens during Alfonso XIII's reign, which is the First World War, which Spain did not get involved in formally. It was neutral during the First World War. Alfonso XIII had connections, family connections to royalty on both sides of the conflict. He was married to the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Did he ever consider joining the war? Or do we know if he ever had any doubts about his neutrality? And if he had joined, which side do you think he would have supported?
Now, you would be surprised. At the beginning of the war, Alfonso XIII, another of his personal objectives, especially after 1910, remember in 1909 or 1910, the royal family of Portugal are killed. They are killed. There is a republic proclaimed in Portugal. But from 1910 onwards, Portugal undergoes a period of total crisis, short-lived governments. There are semi-civil wars. So Alfonso XIII thinks that Europe will welcome to bring peace in Portugal. And remember the Europe we are talking about. The Europe of 1914 is a Europe of crowns, the King of England, the Kaiser. So Portugal is one of the odd one out. So he thinks he will get the support of the great powers to some kind of, I don't know if annexation, some kind of control, but to take over Portugal. And there are interesting conversations that he's got basically with the British, because the British is the great ally, the traditional ally of Portugal. And when he is in the middle of this conversation and the British are dubious, the First World War breaks out. At the beginning of the war, Alfonso XIII is very much pro-Allied. Surprise, surprise. Not the court. The court is dominated by his mother. As you said, he's married to a British queen, but the British queen doesn't have any strength. The one that is running the show in the court aristocracy is the mother, the queen mother. So the court is very pro-Austrian, very pro-central powers. The king himself is not, because the king thinks my allies in Morocco are the French, and I should do a deal with the British in order to get Portugal. But at the beginning of the war, there are two things. First of all, everybody thinks, everybody in Spain, in Germany, and in England, that the war is going to be over very soon. Remember that by Christmas, it's all over. They thought there would be a couple of big battles, and that's it. The second is that the prime minister at the time, a man called Eduardo Dato, and most of the political elites think that it's not worth for Spain entering a war because, after all, they don't have any formal alliance with any of the two sides, and because of a distant incident in the Balkans, why should Spain enter the war? Okay, that's 1914. If we move on 3 years later, there is a new event that completely, there are several things, but the key one is the fall of the Tsar in Russia. When the Tsar falls in Russia, Alfonso XIII is absolutely livid. He's absolutely disgusted that the Allies, remember, Russia is part of the alliance, that the Allies couldn't care less, and they are prepared to accept the new provisional government. They couldn't care now about the Tsar. You could go on and on about the Tsar because the Tsar is dominated by the Tsarina, who's German. It's all these kind of things. They kind of welcome get rid of the Tsar. So this is a kind of awakening call for Alfonso XIII. And Alfonso XIII now becomes the strongest pro-German in Spain. Because in 1917, there are so many reasons, so many causes. The Germans had done so many brutalities all over the place, including Spain, that there are more than reasons to enter the war on the side of the Allies. And in fact, one of his prime ministers, the prime minister from December 1915 to April 1917, a man called Conde de Romanones, actually, and this is, I've got the documents, that Romanones is ready, at the very least, to follow the lead of the Americans. Remember the Americans. There are several things why Spain should say no more to the Germans. First of all, because the Germans are doing all nasty things and more in Morocco, in Spanish Morocco, to create trouble to French Morocco. That's the first one. Second one, the Germans are sinking. They have declared this all-out submarine campaign. And by 1917, the Germans have sunk 20% of the Spanish merchant fleet. And
really?
Oh, yes. I've got the list there. By the end of the war, they had sunk 70-odd Spanish. And remember that the reason why the United States breaks relations in February 1917 with Germany is because enough is enough. You had sunk too many of our ships. So goodbye. That's the moment that you have all these letters and more that Romanones says. He talks to the French ambassador and says, we are going to break with Germany. 2 or 3 days later, Romanones is toppled from the government, is ousted. And this is Alfonso XIII. And then up to the end of the war, there is a time as late as October 1918 in which, again, the Germans carry on doing all nasty things. And the Minister of the Navy says to the government in the cabinet, neutrality cannot be touched because the king says so. Remember that by 1916, 1917, it's clear that you have two alternatives in the war. Either you remain neutral, fair enough, or you join the allies. You cannot join the Central Powers. It's total suicide. You are surrounded by Portugal, that actually the Portuguese get inside the war to make sure that they are protected. So you have Portugal, that is an allied country. You've got France on the other side. You've got, you cross the Mediterranean, you have Italy. Remember, Italy is, Italians are amazing. They change sides because they get all the concessions. But Italy is another. And then you've got the British Navy. So are you going to say we declare war on the side of the... No, you can't. So neutrality is the best way to side with the Central Powers.
That's really interesting. And obviously at the same time you have this, or Alfonso had this incipient fear of revolution in the style of what happened to the Tsar. If we just go back to this idea then of the Iron Surgeon, you said, as you said, this idea was eventually proven correct, or perhaps it was kind of almost imagined into existence, if you like, by the fact that people have been talking about it for so long, by Miguel Primo de Rivera. How would you characterize him and his politics? He comes to power, or he takes power in 1923.
Primo de Rivera, talking very bluntly, is the instrument of the Catalan industrial bourgeoisie. 1923 is above all a Catalan coup. By Catalan, obviously, I don't mean Catalan people. Because one of the ironic things is that normally, Catalan nationalists, normally it's all about, I can tell you this because I'm a Catalan myself. And I know them very well. Them and now is all about protecting our economic interest. And in fact, Catalan nationalism is created in 1901 because of the loss of the colonies. And Catalonia also controls a lot of the shipping, so a lot of the industry created in Barcelona comes from the wealth done in Cuba. So there are close links between the Catalan industrial elites and Cuba. Now, when Cuba is lost, the Catalan elites think these people are useless. As the army more or less concluded from different sides, these people are useless. These people cannot even maintain the empire. Barcelona is the largest industrial metropolis in Spain. At the time, it's also the largest city. The largest industry is in Catalonia. So in Catalonia, you have the largest, the most important, the most powerful industrial elites of the country, but you also have the largest organized proletariat. You have all these factories. So the factory bosses, most of them are Catalan nationalists, but you have this large proletariat that becomes the biggest force within the anarcho-syndicalist movement. From 1919 onwards, you've got in France, in Italy, in Germany, there is the spread of Bolshevism of this idea. So you have these red years in Europe going on. So you've got massive growth. 400,000, basically the entire Catalan labor force joins the so-called Sindicatos Únicos, the new industrial unions controlled by the CNT. You have massive mobilization. You have massive amount of strikes. And this creates a lot of fear within the industrial classes. They resort to the army. So if you look at the newspapers from 1919 to 1923, every front page is about strikes, social unrest, and killings. Both the army and the industrialists resort to killing tactics, and we are talking also the anarchists. They have the famous or infamous action groups. They are killing employers, they are killing foremen. So Primo de Rivera is the man that finally, the leader military general in Barcelona is Miguel Primo de Rivera.
So he reasserts the control that has been lost.
That's the idea. That's the idea. So he's cheered when he leaves Barcelona. He's cheered by all the elites of Catalonia, and they see him as the cyborg that goes to Madrid to restore law and order and all these things. Yes, and of course his accomplice, the man who condones the coup, is King Alfonso XIII. Alfonso XIII is the first one who is paranoid about revolutions, is paranoid about unrest, is paranoid about many things, and he is the one who detests his politicians. He thinks they are useless, corrupt, too liberal, too frivolous. So he welcomes, as the King of Italy did, an iron surgeon, and this is Primo de Rivera.
And how popular and successful, so there's two different questions really, how popular and how successful did Rivera turn out to be among the Spanish people?
Well, there are two halves of his rule. He rules Spain from September 1923 to January 1930. So the first half of his rule, he's extremely popular. Because nobody cries. Nobody cries when the government's this liberal system disappears. They don't have popular mandate, they don't have any popular following. That's why it's so different to 1936, when the army tries to take over 1936 and overthrow the Republic. The Republic has a mandate, has following. The supporters of the Republican Party, the soldiers, go and fight back. But in 1923, the politicians are the first to welcome Primo de Rivera. So the first half of his rule, actually this is going to be my next book, so I still have to investigate this. But his first part is he's very popular. He's welcome because he's seen as a more man of the people. He talks the language, as I told you before, these politicians talk this verbose, rhetoric, grandiose. No, Primo de Rivera talks like the man in the bar. He is kind of seen as a man of the people. He is the man who puts an end to disorder. He introduces a lot of legislation that is useless, but he seems to be introducing legislation to put an end to corruption and to all of the things that had been before. And also, almost by accident, he manages to finish the war in Morocco. The war in Morocco was an ulcer for the Spanish army, for the Spanish people, for the Spanish coffers, for everything. And in 1925, the war in Morocco is finished. So I've written before, and others have agreed or said the same, that if Primo de Rivera in 1926, he decided to say, look, I came here, I said I was going to put an end to the corruption, I was going to put an end to the nepotism, I was going to restore law and order, and I was going to put an end to the wars in Morocco, and etc. And also the 1920s is a period of, the first half of the 1920s is a period of great economic growth, massive industrialization in Spain and all that. He goes, and he's now down in the history books as one of the greatest statesmen ever in Spanish history. But as most politicians, that's not only Miguel Primo de Rivera, they never know when to go. So he clings on. And then things begin to go wrongly. Things begin to go wrongly because a lot of people who had thought Primo de Rivera should have withdrawn because he kept saying he wanted to go. So there are many army generals that again start plotting against him. There are many of the old politicians that are also plotting against him. Plus the fact that Primo de Rivera also completely loses control of the situation because he wants to, basically from 1923 to 1925, he's ruled by decree. There is no system. It's a dictatorship ruling by decree. In 1925, he tries perhaps to copy things from Italy and to create the foundations of a new political order, new, more authoritarian political order. As an architect, it's a complete disaster. Primo de Rivera is a man who one day he says white, the next week he says black. He never knows exactly what to do. His followers are divided. He never creates a real strong political party around himself. He is a completely improviser. And when you're an improviser and things seem to go your way, well, at the beginning, this guy is kind of funny. We accept him. But after a while, that the joke is not good anymore. And obviously, the moment is when the economic crisis hits Spain in 1928-29, what Primo de Rivera had done, that he broke with the tradition of the liberal politicians, is that the liberal politicians is the old system of balancing the budget. You normally don't spend more than you earn. Primo de Rivera expanded dramatically the public sector, expanded a lot in infrastructure, created all these massive organizations and corporations and industrial bodies. Where he finds himself in 1929 with a huge debt, the coffers empty, no political system, nobody really behind him. And by then is the beginning also of strikes, discontent. And there's a combination of things. And I agree with those who say that those who overthrow Primo de Rivera are not exactly the working classes, but are mostly the people who welcome his coming. The final thing that Primo de Rivera has done that the ruling classes don't forgive him is that he, ironically, has established a good collaboration with the socialists, the other main working class.
Well, he sounds to some extent like a populist, really.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Rather than a genuine figure of the right.
No. The man who's studied more Primo de Rivera is this man called Shlomo Ben-Ami. And he defines Primo de Rivera as a kind of a strange Father Christmas. He's a populist. And in fact, when you compare later on with Franco, Primo de Rivera was not a ruthless dictator. Perhaps that was another of his problems, that he really didn't use that much repression. He allowed the socialists to survive, not only to survive, to enjoy an era of boom. And also he absolutely upset the king. And eventually, to make the story short, and because this is about Alfonso XIII, Alfonso XIII kicks him out. Because, like Mussolini in Italy, don't remember, Primo de Rivera is prime minister. The head of the state is the king. It happened to Mussolini in 1943, that the king of Italy deposes Mussolini as his prime minister. So the king is going to do the same, because he gets upset, because Primo de Rivera fiddling with things, doing things, and also because what he had done until 1923, the king, it was the center of the spotlight. With Primo de Rivera is the guy. And the king also hates that.
So Alfonso stops being king in 1931. I always kind of assumed that because Rivera's demise and Alfonso's demise were so close in time that they were kind of, by that stage, their fortunes are almost intertwined with one another.
Totally.
Why does Alfonso XIII eventually have to leave the stage as well?
Well, because Alfonso XIII makes just another extraordinary blunder. Alfonso XIII had bet on a dictatorship in 1923. The dictatorship happened in Spain because the king welcomed the dictator. I could go on and on, but it would have been very easy for the king. It happened in 1920. So it would have been, again in 1923, relatively easy for the king to stop the coup. And in fact, I've got all the conversations that they are all typed. The conversations that it was quite similar to 1981 with his grandson Juan Carlos. When the coup takes place in September 1923, and the king is then on his holiday place in San Sebastian, what he does is he contacts the military leader of every region. That is called in Spain the Captain General. And all the Captain Generals in Spain at the time, but one, tell him to Alfonso, well, they give the response that Alfonso XIII wanted to hear, that we are behind you. So basically, if he wanted to say to Primo de Rivera, no, Primo de Rivera is finished. But he doesn't. He welcomes Primo de Rivera. Then the king calls Primo de Rivera to Madrid and tells his government, you are out. and gives power to Primo de Rivera. Now, in 1930, basically he does the same. He consults the military leaders and asks them, what do you think? And all of them say basically the same. We are with you. So Primo de Rivera, you go. Goodbye. The big mistake of Alfonso XIII, he made many in his life, but this is the last one, the one that cost him the throne. Well, let's say the penultimate mistake was to have welcomed the dictatorship. And the final mistake is that the dictatorship had come to Spain because the political system did not work anymore. So Primo de Rivera was the person who came to solve the social unrest of the country because the political system was completely in tatters. So his mistake is the king, in 1930, he wanted to push the bottom back to 1923. Do you understand? What he said is, Primo de Rivera, you're out. And then he called the politicians he had dismissed 7 years later and said, you're back in business. Now, if the system didn't work in 1923, how is it going to work in 1930? And to make matters worse, his politicians, the politicians that had been the dynastic politicians of 1923, most of them didn't say, yes, here we are again, thank you for calling us, we've been waiting for 7 years. They never forgave the king. Some of them came back, but many of them didn't. Many of them actually led the Republican opposition against the king.
And that is the beginning of the end of the monarchy and the start of the Second Republic.
Yes.
To try and sum this up, I mean, this has been a really wide-ranging and interesting conversation about Alfonso XIII. He doesn't sound like a very savvy person as a leader.
Yes. No, his main problem is that he thought he was.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think that, I mean, this is something that, obviously, the kind of elephant in the room for all of this conversation, really, especially the latter half, is what happens in the 30s, the Spanish Civil War, the kind of intense polarization of politics to the point where you have this horrific civil war. I know very few things are inevitable in history, obviously, but do you think that the collapse of politics, in the context of this Iron Surgeon theory and the embarrassment of losing the empire and the psychological decline of the Spanish state, do you think that the Civil War was always, under those circumstances, highly likely? Or do you think that with better governance in the 1910s, the 1920s, by people like Alfonso and others, that awful period in Spanish history of 1936 to 39 could have been avoided?
Well, I'll try to be brief in this answer.
Sure.
The answer is yes. And it goes without saying that if the monarchist politicians had started or introduced the necessary reforms, to carry out the necessary reforms, to bring about a transition from this kind of oligarchic elite politics into a more modern democratic system, the answer is the Republic would not have come. Alfonso XIII would have become a more... Obviously, we are talking here science fiction, political fiction, because it never happened. We can only speculate. In fact, probably the wisest, for me, the wisest of all the politicians that Alfonso XIII had, and Alfonso XIII treated him brutally wrong, brutally bad, was a man called Antonio Maura. And one of his first speeches, because most of the elite politicians, I would say the bulk of them, really implemented what in Spanish, I'm not sure this can be well translated into English, that what in Spanish is called ir tirando. Ir tirando means kind of keep going, like the song Be Happy, things are okay, don't worry about tomorrow. Yeah. We are doing very well. The country is collapsing around us, but we are fine, and as long as we are fine, everything is jolly good. One of the exceptions was this man called Antonio Maura. And one of his first speeches in Parliament is he said to his fellow politicians, you should be aware that there is a dramatic divorce between us, the politicians, and them, the people. Unless we connect this, unless we close this gap, there is going to be a subversion somewhere. This is going to explode. Now, Maura was several times in power, and many times he was kicked out by the king. One thing that you need to remember is that the political crises of the period are known as crisis orientales. Now, orientales, I always ask the students, crisis orientales, what do you think this means? And they think orientales in English means Eastern crisis, so they think something happening in the Far East. No, Far East, no. The residence of the monarch, the residence of Alfonso XIII, is el Palacio de Oriente. So most of the crises of the time were manufactured in the palace. Because I told you before, there is this turno pacífico. Okay, the turno pacífico is now you, later me. But who is the ultimate arbiter that now you and now the other one? Is the head of the state, the king. Now, when Alfonso XII, that ruled very briefly, he died soon, and then the Queen Mother were in power, they didn't touch this much. Now, when Alfonso XIII comes, no, that changes. He wants to reign, he wants to govern, he wants to rule. So he starts creating all kinds of crises, dismissing governments, calling other governments, and there are from 1917 to 1923, I think there are 17 governments. So Alfonso XIII basically is the man who impeded any kind of reform. And actually, he kicked out a couple of times Maura himself. So, trying to answer your question, yes, if there had been a proper, because from outside, if you're a political scientist and you look at this from a political scientist point of view, and you look at the Spanish system, you think it's a quite modern, fairly progressive for the period. Spain had all the civil liberties that you can imagine. Spain was one of the first countries in Europe that granted universal manhood suffrage. Women at the time, I'm sorry, but that came very late, not only in Spain. So in theory, what you needed is this artificial system to put some flesh. If that had happened, and the system had developed into a more democratic, and I would tell you, most Republicans were fairly moderate, most. And the socialists are like Labour here. It wouldn't have been too difficult to bring them into the fold. But it never happened. And Alfonso XIII was the first book I wrote actually many years ago. I finished the chapter about this, saying he went because he was the ultimate obstacle to the modernization of the country. By 1931, the country was a much modern country than it was in the 1870s. And the last bulwark of the past was Alfonso XIII. So he had to go.
I think if I could sum up the conversation we've had and this period of Spanish history, it's a cautionary tale in how elites view the country and how elites converse or perhaps in this case don't converse with the people that they are ruling over, ostensibly representing. That's been a fantastic piece of dialogue, Paco. I've loved speaking to you today. Where can people find your work?
Well, in this day and age, it's very easy because, you see, I'm now beginning to feel like Alfonso XIII, that I'm also a man of another century that dreads modernization. And modernization means all this digital, IT, that for me is also a question of headache. But this day and age is very easy. You just enter into the web, you write my name, or you get into my page, the page of the department in the University of Bristol, and you can find my work. Or simply, you can write, I get it. You wouldn't believe how many emails I get, not from British people, I don't know why, but you get them from Americans, American students. that God knows why they discover your name, and they write to you saying, oh, I'm doing this and the other, and I'm writing an essay about this. Can you help me? And being myself a fool, I always help. So if American students write to me emails or whatever, I'm always happy to reply to anybody. You can easily find me in Amazon. You put my name, and you have, on Amazon you only find my books. But in the university website, you have my research, you have what I'm doing, and you have my email there. So I'm always open to, because as my wife says, I'm a boring guy that loves talking so much about my work. and the only person I could talk about work here is with you, because if I go downstairs and start talking about Alfonso XIII, you'll find him tomorrow in East London. They have kicked me out of the house.
Excellent. Okay, Paco, thank you very much. It's been fantastic.
It's been a pleasure. I hope everything has been well recorded. And
as it turns out, the conversation wasn't so well recorded after all, because I managed to lose the tail end of mine and Paco's conversation. In any case, I hope you all enjoyed that, and thank you for listening. As always, if you have a few minutes, please craft a lovely 5-star review for the podcast on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.